He was the son of a king, but not the first in line. He was the child of a controversial marriage, a union born of tragedy and scandal. And yet, he would become the wisest man to ever walk the earth. His name was Solomon, and his rise to power was anything but simple. As one of David's youngest sons, his path to the throne was not guaranteed. His older brother Adonijah had already declared himself king, gathering chariots, soldiers, and supporters. The court was in chaos, the nation on edge. But in the middle of this political storm, an aging and fragile King David made a decisive move. He ordered that Solomon be anointed king immediately, riding on the royal mule through the streets of Jerusalem while trumpets sounded and the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" It was a bold moment of divine intervention, a clear sign that Solomon was God's chosen one. And just like that, a new chapter in Israel's history began. Before we go deeper into the incredible life and tragic fall of Solomon, take a moment to comment below. What country are you watching this from? And if you love learning about biblical history and the stories that still shape our world today, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more powerful journeys through Scripture. Solomon ascended the throne not with the strength of his sword, but with the will of God behind him. His reign began under the shadow of his father's greatness. David had been a warrior, a poet, a man after God's own heart. Now Solomon had to step into that legacy and do so with wisdom, humility, and strength. The early days of his kingship were filled with bold moves. He removed potential threats, including his own brother Adonijah, and solidified his rule. But even in these political decisions, we see a young man trying to balance justice with mercy, strength with compassion. He inherited not just a throne, but a divine mission, to shepherd the people of Israel in peace and righteousness. And in the midst of all this, Solomon made a choice that would change everything. He went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, and there God came to him in a dream. What happened next is one of the most astonishing moments in the Bible. In that dream, the Creator of the universe appeared to Solomon and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Imagine that. The God who formed the stars and parted the seas offers you anything: wealth, power, a long life, victory over your enemies. Solomon could have asked for any of it, but he didn't. Standing at the edge of unimaginable opportunity, Solomon humbled himself. He remembered that he was just a young man, unsure of how to lead, standing in the place of his father, the greatest king Israel had ever known. And so he asked, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." It was not just a wise request, it was a deeply spiritual one. Solomon knew that ruling people required more than military might or political strategy. It required understanding, discernment, a heart aligned with truth. And God was pleased. So pleased, in fact, that he not only gave Solomon wisdom beyond measure, but added riches, honor, and peace. There would be no one like him, not before and not after. Solomon awoke from the dream and immediately returned to Jerusalem, full of awe and reverence. He offered sacrifices and held a feast. His reign was now marked by something extraordinary, a divine gift of wisdom that would touch every corner of the kingdom, and that gift would soon be tested. Not long after his dream at Gibeon, Solomon faced a case that would make his name famous across the land. Two women came before the king, both claiming to be the mother of a single baby. There were no witnesses, no evidence. In a moment of unmatched insight, Solomon ordered that the child be cut in two, with half given to each woman. It was shocking, but it revealed the truth. The real mother cried out and offered to give up the child to save his life, while the other agreed to the cruel act. Solomon then declared the true mother known and returned the baby to her. This moment was not just a clever judgment, it was a demonstration of divine wisdom in action. The people of Israel marveled, and the world began to take notice. Solomon's fame spread far beyond the borders of his kingdom. Leaders and scholars from distant lands traveled to hear him speak, to ask him questions, and to witness the brilliance of the man whom God had blessed. As his influence grew, so did his achievements. Solomon embarked on massive construction projects, building palaces, fortresses, and trading centers. But his most magnificent accomplishment was the temple in Jerusalem, a house for the Lord unlike any the world had ever seen. The temple was built with precision and splendor. It took 7 years to complete and stood as the crowning symbol of Israel's faith and prosperity. When it was finished, Solomon led a grand dedication ceremony, offering sacrifices and prayers. The glory of the Lord filled the temple, and fire came down from heaven, a clear sign that God was pleased. Israel had never known such peace, such unity, such power. Under Solomon's rule, the nation became a beacon among the kingdoms of the earth. Silver was as common as stone in Jerusalem. Trade routes brought wealth from Arabia, Africa, and the Far East. Every corner of society prospered, and at the center of it all stood Solomon, wise, respected, and blessed. Solomon's kingdom shimmered with glory. His wisdom was unmatched, his wealth immeasurable, his influence felt across nations. Israel had never known such peace and prosperity. The temple stood as a breathtaking symbol of covenant and worship, and Jerusalem became the heart of a flourishing empire. But beneath the brilliance, something darker had begun to take root, something subtle, almost invisible at first, yet deeply dangerous. For all his wisdom, Solomon began to make compromises that would eventually unravel everything he had built. And it began with something God had explicitly warned his people about: foreign alliances through marriage. In ancient times, kings often sealed treaties and political alliances by marrying daughters of other rulers. And Solomon, seeking peace and influence, did this again and again. But these were not simply political unions, they were spiritual openings to foreign gods and their seductive worship. Solomon took wives from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and Egypt, women who grew up with gods like Ashtoreth, Moloch, Chemosh, and Baal. Altogether, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and many of them came with idols, rituals, and expectations. These women did not simply adjust to Israel's faith. Instead, they brought their own gods with them. And gradually, their influence reached the heart of the king. Scripture tells us that in his old age, Solomon's wives turned his heart after other gods. It was not an abrupt fall, but a slow erosion. A series of choices, moments of weakness, rationalizations that began to shape a new pattern in his life. The man who once prayed for wisdom and built the house of the Lord now began constructing altars and high places for foreign gods. He built shrines for Chemosh on the hill east of Jerusalem, for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites, and for the gods of his many wives. These were not hidden places. They stood in view of the holy city where God's presence once descended in fire. The same king who led a nation in worship now led them into confusion and compromise. This was more than idolatry, it was betrayal. God had made a covenant with Solomon. Twice he had appeared to him, not just in passing visions, but in moments of clear, divine encounter. He had warned him, "If you walk before me faithfully, I will establish your royal throne. But if you or your descendants turn away and worship other gods, I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them." These were not vague suggestions. They were clear terms of covenant, spoken directly from heaven. And yet Solomon turned away. The one who had been given wisdom beyond any other man failed to obey the very God who gave it. This wasn't a mistake of ignorance. It was a choice, a deliberate drift toward what was forbidden, all in the name of love, diplomacy, and personal pleasure. And God was not silent. The Bible says, "The Lord became angry with Solomon," not disappointed, not saddened, angry. The relationship had been deep and personal. Solomon had stood in the glory of God, had built a temple for his name, had written prayers that moved the heavens, and now he was bowing to lifeless idols made by human hands. God's response was just. He said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." Yet, even in judgment, there was mercy. God said he would not do this in Solomon's lifetime, for the sake of David, his father, and he would not take the entire kingdom from Solomon's son, but only 10 of the 12 tribes. Judah would remain, a remnant for David's sake, a flicker of hope in the midst of discipline. But the sentence had been passed. The kingdom would be divided. Solomon's legacy would be broken, and God did not wait long to begin the unraveling. As Solomon's heart strayed from him, the Lord raised up adversaries, enemies who would bring pressure from all sides. The peace that had defined his early reign began to crumble. First came Hadad the Edomite, a royal from the ancient enemy of Israel. He had fled to Egypt as a child during David's military campaigns, but returned during Solomon's reign, burning with hatred for Israel. He stirred unrest from the south. Then came Rezon of Damascus, another enemy who gathered men and ruled over Aram. From the north, he harassed Israel with raiding bands and guerrilla attacks. These external threats were more than political. They were divine instruments of correction. But God was not finished. The most devastating adversary would come from within Solomon's own administration. Jeroboam was a talented, ambitious official whom Solomon had placed in charge of the labor force from the tribe of Joseph. He was sharp, charismatic, and full of potential. But more importantly, he was chosen by God. The prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam one day on the road, took off his new cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and gave 10 of them to Jeroboam. It was a symbolic act. God was about to give him 10 tribes of Israel. Through the prophet, God declared that he was taking the kingdom from Solomon's house because of idolatry. Jeroboam would rule over most of Israel, but only if he remained faithful to God's commands. This was not just a change in leadership, it was a divine redirection of history. Solomon got wind of the prophecy and immediately tried to kill Jeroboam. The man fled to Egypt, where he remained until Solomon's death. But the damage was done. The cracks in the kingdom were no longer hidden. Dissatisfaction grew among the people. The heavy taxes, the forced labor, the growing divide between the ruling elite and the common tribes, these were symptoms of deeper spiritual decay. The people could sense it. The kingdom that had once felt like heaven on earth was beginning to feel heavy, burdened, and divided. God had given Solomon everything: wisdom, peace, wealth, honor, and in return, he had asked for obedience and devotion. But Solomon let his heart be divided. He allowed love for his wives and pride in his empire to outweigh love for the one who had made him great. And once that foundation crumbled, the rest began to fall. Enemies now surrounded the kingdom like vultures circling a wounded animal. The age of peace was gone. The presence of God, once so tangible in the temple, now felt distant. And Solomon, once full of songs and proverbs, now began to reflect in sorrow and bitterness. He would later write words like these in the book of Ecclesiastes: "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." These were not the words of a man who lacked success. They were the lament of a man who had tasted everything the world had to offer and found it empty. Wisdom without obedience, power without purity, prosperity without purpose. And yet, even in this dark moment, we are reminded that God had not forgotten his promise to David. A glimmer of hope remained. The kingdom would split, yes. The line of David would suffer loss, but it would not be destroyed. For from that line, centuries later, another king would be born, one greater than Solomon, yet humble and obedient. One who would not build a temple of stone, but a kingdom of hearts. A king who would not fall, a king who would save. Solomon had everything a man could possibly desire: riches beyond imagination, the loyalty of his people, unrivaled wisdom that made kings and queens from distant lands seek his counsel, palaces filled with luxury, servants to carry out his every command, artists, scholars, architects, musicians, each working to bring his vision to life. But with all of this surrounding him, there was one thing Solomon could not escape: the emptiness that comes when the heart grows cold toward God. The further he drifted from his Creator, the more meaningless everything became. And though he was still admired by many, the voice inside him grew heavier, more weary, more burdened. That voice became louder than the applause of the crowds, louder than the sound of chariots or the music of the palace. It was the voice of a man who had tried to fill the void of the soul with things that do not last. It was the voice of regret. In his later years, Solomon began to write again, but not with the joy and confidence of his younger days. This time, the words were filled with sorrow, with reflection, with the bitter taste of disillusionment. The book of Ecclesiastes captures this voice perfectly. "I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind." He writes not as a king filled with vision and strength, but as an old man looking back on a life of missed opportunities and spiritual decline. He describes how he built houses, planted vineyards, made gardens and parks, accumulated silver and gold, acquired singers, and even formed his own personal choir of delight. And then he confesses, "Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless." This is not a man who failed in worldly terms. By every human measure, Solomon succeeded. He reached the very heights of what anyone could dream of achieving, but none of it could satisfy his soul once he had walked away from the God who gave it all to him in the first place. His wisdom allowed him to see clearly the futility of living for pleasure alone. And yet, even as he speaks truth, there is a tragic undertone. He knew what was right, he knew what mattered, but he had already strayed too far. The clarity of his wisdom only made the weight of his failures more painful. Solomon's words echo through time as a solemn warning. Knowledge without devotion leads only to despair. When the fear of God is lost, even the greatest accomplishments become dust. As his reign neared its end, the kingdom Solomon once ruled with peace and strength began to fracture from within. Discontent simmered just beneath the surface. His once grateful people now groaned under heavy burdens. In order to maintain his vast building projects and luxurious court, Solomon had imposed high taxes and forced labor on many of the tribes of Israel. What began as national pride turned into bitterness and exhaustion. The people no longer saw the temple or the royal palaces as symbols of God's glory. They saw them as reminders of their toil and Solomon's excess. The unity that had defined David's reign was slipping away. The tribes, once bound together in worship and purpose, now felt isolated and unheard. This unrest was not accidental. It was the natural result of a kingdom whose leader had lost his spiritual compass. Solomon no longer led from the strength of God's presence, but from the pride of his own intellect. And when a leader forgets God, the people feel it. The cracks in the kingdom were not just economic or political, they were spiritual. The covenant relationship that once made Israel distinct among the nations was being neglected. Idol worship had been allowed, pagan altars had been built, and worst of all, the man who once stood before the people and declared the greatness of the Lord now stood silent as other gods were worshipped in his land. Solomon may have tried to hold it all together, but the weight of disobedience is heavy. The peace he once enjoyed was now replaced by adversaries rising from all directions. From foreign kings attacking the borders to internal opposition gaining strength, the once glorious kingdom of Israel was teetering on the edge. The prophecy given to Jeroboam through the prophet Ahijah now loomed like a shadow over the palace. 10 tribes would be torn away. The kingdom would be divided. God had made it clear. The house of Solomon would not rule over a united Israel after his death. And yet there is no record of Solomon repenting, no plea for mercy, no return to the faith of his youth. Just a slow, solemn decline. Solomon's final years are described with sobering brevity in the scriptures. There is no dramatic ending, no final speech, no last psalm of redemption. The man who had written thousands of proverbs and songs fades quietly from the pages of history. The Bible simply tells us, Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. The king, who once stood in the glory of the Lord, now passed into death with a kingdom crumbling behind him and a legacy forever marked by compromise. His son Rehoboam would take the throne, but the division was already at the door. Jeroboam would return from Egypt, just as the prophet had foretold, and 10 tribes would follow him, breaking away from the house of David. The united kingdom, glorious under David and Solomon, was now shattered. The golden age of Israel was over. Solomon's story is a tragic paradox. He began with promise, was blessed beyond imagination, spoke wisdom that still guides people today, and yet, in the end, he fell. He did not fall in battle. He was not conquered by enemies. His fall came from within. It came from the slow drift of the heart away from God. The wisest man in the world failed to guard the most important thing of all, his relationship with the Lord, and in doing so, he lost what truly mattered. But even in this tragedy, there is something to learn. Solomon's life reminds us that knowledge alone cannot save. Success, comfort, and recognition cannot satisfy the soul. Only a heart that remains close to God can stand the test of time. The decline of Solomon's kingdom was not a failure of strategy or governance, it was a failure of the heart, and his story remains as a warning and a lesson for every generation. In the end, the God who judged Solomon also preserved a remnant. He remembered his promise to David. Though the kingdom was torn, the line was not cut off. From the tribe of Judah, a descendant would come, not a king of gold and chariots, but a king who would ride a donkey, a king not of palaces, but of hearts. Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the true and faithful king, would fulfill what Solomon never could. Where Solomon failed, Christ would triumph. Where Solomon's heart strayed, Christ's heart would remain pure. Where Solomon's wisdom faltered, Christ's wisdom would be perfect. And through him, the broken would be healed, the lost would be found, and the kingdom would be restored, not in political power, but in eternal peace. Solomon's fall is not just a cautionary tale. It is a mirror. It asks us, what are we building our lives on? What is ruling our hearts? Are we pursuing wisdom without worship? Success without surrender? Are we giving our affection to things that fade, or are we staying close to the one who gives all things meaning? The story of Solomon ends in silence, but our stories are still being written. Let us learn from his rise and from his fall, and remember that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and only those who walk in his ways will stand firm to the end.